We're starting. Welcome to Pacific Unitarian Universalist Church. We're off to a remarkably casual start. The holidays have just really set in here, apparently. Figgy pudding dancing through people's heads, all of that. It's a pretty light week here at church. We just had Christmas Eve service, which was nice, and we don't have too much this week. There's going to be no pizza on Thursday. There's really nothing scheduled this week, oddly enough. So I'm going to light the chalice with the words from Gregory Jones, who says, "We've just experienced the longest night of the year. And we're warned by the certain knowledge that since last Tuesday, we will welcome more light each day than today. It has been for eons, for billions of years, that the coming of light brings life." Let's think about that for a minute. Light equals life. May we be awed by the great miracles that strike us, and as Jones says, faithfully nurture that mystery. Today we dedicate to remember that Earth's peoples across time, if they've celebrated anything, marked anything, it was the mechanics and journey of the sun. In fact, if you wanted to pick the one universal thing we've worshipped on the top of the list before any god or goddesses or even all the gods and goddesses, without question, it's the sun, and it makes complete sense, right? It hovers above all people. The sun is less important spiritually to people in jungles than it is to people in the desert, which makes sense, right? It's a singular thing that we all experience and we all feel. We don't, like the sun goes down, it does not take long to realize we're a little bit away from the rays of the sun. I'm going to go out on a limb and say it is the most obvious object of veneration on earth, if you think about it. We feel its power all the time. We feel its waxing in us hot in the summer, and we feel its lack in the winter and waning. Let's pause for a minute and say that with all due respect to the Christ child and the courageous Maccabees and all the other light-related holidays around this time of year, the primary original human holiday of the season is Solstice. And in the days gone by, people had a deep interest in what this great ball of energy that crosses the sky was going to do next. And in that sentiment to all those rituals that fall under Solstice was a simple sentiment. Hey, come back. We like you. But today, with most of us not being farmers and personally necessarily invested in the charting the migrations of large game and all the things that the seasons bring, we're a little bit, particularly in California, isolated from those movements. And we don't live in an outdoorsy kind of way, most of us. What are we supposed to do with solstice? Today, we engage that question. Mind, science, faith, all put together. So beyond honoring our religious heritage, I'm about honoring our religious heritage. We're going to ask what the heart of solstice is today. But all that starts after our opening hymn, which is Gather the Spirit, and you can sing along to the degree that you're comfortable. I'll put my mask on.
Gather the spirit of heart and mind.
We don't have any kids. Well, no, I'm not going to do that to Alma. Been through enough this week. It's all right. Huh? Well, they can come in when they want. I'm going to tell you a little bit of... So, 190 years ago today, Darwin set forth on that famous trip around the Horn of South America and up to the Galapagos, and had all of his revelations with the experiences. And when he was a kid, he wasn't a very good student. His dad was kind of a prestigious guy, and he sort of tried to force him to study math and Latin and all these things. And Darwin was really not a very good student at all. And he would run home, and he was always a collector, though. He would forever collect moths and bark and all this kind of stuff, so it became his claim to fame. So I was going to ask the kids, I was like, don't give up on the things that you're particularly good at. For all of us, there's sort of a unique kind of genius, and he really, probably without knowing it, had a sense of genius inside of him that he pursued. So when he was 16, he was sent off to become a doctor. Dad sort of thought he would be a good doctor. Charles hated it, couldn't stand the sight of blood. He lasted there about a year. And then the other respectable tradition was to become a minister, and then they shipped him off when he was about a year later, 17 or so, to become a minister, and he didn't do very well at that either, and he would run out and sort of collect beetles and stuff. So he was still a collector, and then eventually Fitzroy, this captain, liked the shape of his nose, and he needed some kind of, elite kind of, well-trained, Darwin came from a prestigious family and had the decorum of someone he could stand on the ship. They ended up hating each other, and they had this 5-year journey around South America that started today, 190 years ago. Think about that. It's on the docks of, somewhere in England. I'm not sure where they took off from. But they went down there, and Charles found bones in Argentina, these massive bones that made no sense with any of the animals that were known at the time. And of course, there was also, we hadn't explored the world that much, at least not in the centers of education in Europe. The story hadn't been unified for humans at all at that time. So he got to Galapagos, and he found these massive turtles, and he found these dragon-like lizards, and it just kind of blew his mind, and it started him on the thought, which was the greatest thought of all time, which turned out to be the idea that things evolve, and things evolve based on competition for resources and species and all that kind of stuff. And he came back home, and he kind of sat with that, and brought back a lot of things, and he sort of toodled with experiments. He studied worms quite a bit. I mean, he just sort of he didn't really work. And it turns out that it was thought that he got some sort of tropical disease. I think Chagas disease is what they think that he had. So he was sort of kind of mildly disabled for the rest of his life, and he kind of hid away, and he had this sacred time, 2 hours a day, but I think he spent more there, kind of in his own little reclusive area. He had 10 kids. He sort of thought of as a nice guy, but he didn't like people that much. And he sort of studied his stuff, and then it was only when another scientist sort of had caught on to the idea and was about to publish a paper. He was sort of entrenched in the scientific circles that he ended up writing The Origin of the Species, which was groundbreaking. And then 7 years later, he wrote The Descent of Man, which then got the whole comparison to monkeys. Both of those challenged the religious orthodoxy at the time, which was scripture. And so people at that time had never conceived that the idea that things changed that much, and they had never conceived that the lifespan of Earth was quite as long. Both those things conflicted. They couldn't, right? Once you got one, you got the other. Does that make sense? Right? You can't, so they thought that everything that sort of poured off Noah's Ark was everything that was on Noah's Ark, and it was left from the flood. So it was very hard on him. His wife was very religious, and he was reasonably religious. He went to a Unitarian church, which was still Christian at the time. He went sometimes. He wasn't a regular like most of you. He was smarter than that. No, I'm kidding. And he published those works, and he eventually, he eventually died. But it's thought of as that he came up with the single greatest idea ever thought. That's Darwin's contribution. And interestingly enough, he was also born on the exact same day that Abraham Lincoln was born. which is amazing, right? February 12th or February 9th, which one whatever one it is, it's the same day. The two arguably most important people, at least in the Western European world and the sort of white world, born for that century, were born at the exact same time. Kind of cool. There we go. So we'll pass on singing out our kids. I don't think we have to do that. And we will go to Morning Has Broken. We're going to put Leanne to work lighting candles for us, just back from her medical vacation. And yeah. I'm going to do a guided meditation on about imagining us to be at Newgrange in Ireland, which is an old pagan site. So I invite you to just find a still spot, put your feet on the floor. Just step back in time, if you would. It's a little more than 5,000 years ago. You can stare up. There's going to be some images of Newgrange above you if you want to cheat. About 3200 BCE, we would be gathered in the ancient forests near the Boyne River on a big island that would come to be known as Ireland. Wasn't known that way yet. The Celts or the Celts haven't even arrived yet, and the neighboring country of England has not yet built its Stonehenge. It's the same in distant lands. 5,000 years ago, the pyramids of Egypt have yet to be built. The Great Wall wasn't a wooden fence, and Machu Picchu was just a bold, boring, rocky outcropping. The people, the us, if you'd imagine it, who are building will in our time be called Newgrange, don't have a writing system yet. We don't know their thoughts. We would stand towering above these short-lived people with a life expectancy of about 35 years, and yet engaged in a building project that took over 80 years to complete, it's expected. The grandchildren, some even the great-grandchildren of the people who started that monument would finish it. And oddly enough, it's believed that just 2 lifespans following its completion, it was abandoned. Nobody knows why it was abandoned. Nobody really knows why it was built. There's much to not understand yet. The more modest archaeologists look us in the eye and admit that it's a mystery why they even started the project, how these huge curbstones, as they're called, nearly as big as SUVs, were moved by Stone Age people from their quarries more than 50 miles away over uneven terrain and through forests and up a hill. Some people have ideas about how they did it, different versions of physics. Some people think the aliens were involved. What we do believe is that the smaller stones that complete the project were brought from even further away than 50 miles. What was the purpose of this funnel-like mound on top of a hill that covers about an acre? Nobody really knows. What kept a society engaged in a public works project of this scale when they had no real comforts and seemingly no technology? It's odd. While we stand here watching these ancient people, imagining them doing this back-breaking labor, sadly, we can't bridge the language to find out what it's all about. On the eve of the winter solstice, some 5 millennia ago, one can imagine the mound was completed, and we might imagine ourselves standing at the base of the hill. Chieftains or shamans or matriarchs or midwives dancing in the dark of night, chanting as they process up a hill, one might imagine, to the entrance. We never know. If we fell in behind them, we would follow them down a dark passage into the heart of a mound of an inner chamber and wait with them in silence. Outside, unseen by those entombed in the darkness of the earth, this massive mound, the sky begins to lighten, and then just as the sun nears the lip of the horizon, repeating a ritual pattern that comes from a lifetime of being attuned to the natural cycles, someone probably started to chant. There may have been musical instruments, we don't know. Then suddenly, we do know this, as if magically, a shaft of sunlight dispels the darkness inside that tomb. It's ablaze for about 20 minutes before the angle of that sun is again too great and it falls into darkness again. Let's be with them, with all those hopes in the cold, trying to create a little magic. We take that sentiment and that collective effort to be one with all of humanity, past and present, on the great bead chain of life, and we take that to silence.
In celebration of the winter solstice by Stephanie Noble. Do not be afraid of the darkness. Dark is the rich, fertile earth that cradles the seed, nourishing growth. Dark is the soft night that cradles us to rest. Only in darkness can stars shine across the vastness of space. Only in darkness is the moon's dance so clear. There's mystery woven in the dark, quiet hours. There is magic in the darkness. Do not be afraid of the magic. Do not be afraid. We are born of this magic. It fills our dreams that root, unravel, and reweave itself. In the shelter of the deep, dark night, the dark has its own hue, its own resonance, its own breath. It fills our soul, not with despair, but with promise. Dark is the gestation of our deep and knowing self. Dark is the cave where we rest and renew our soul. We are born of the darkness, and each night we return to the deep, moist womb of our beginnings. Do not be afraid of the darkness, for in the depth of that very darkness comes a first glimpse of our own light. The pure inner light of love and knowing. As it glows and grows, the darkness recedes. As we shed our light, we shed our fear and revel in the wonder of all that is revealed. So do not rush the coming of the sun. Do not crave the lengthening of the day. Celebrate the darkness, here and now, a time of richness, a time of joy.
It's a poignant reading for someone who just lost their grandma. I love buffets. I do. One of my oldest friends, who's a bit of a judgmental foodie, jokes that he's going to have "loved a buffet" carved on my tombstone. Now, to me, calling him a judgmental foodie is a bit redundant, but he's right. I love buffets. Being a frugal person who's able to eat a lot, who's also more impatient than lazy, buffets are generally my favorite kind of restaurants and way of eating. And although COVID has taken hundreds of thousands of lives, millions of lives, isolated people from their jobs and cost them their entire savings, I have suffered the very first world problem of having buffets taken off the table, pun intended. I only say that to set up the silly parallel that when we talk about solstice, unlike many other religious days, we usually understand that there's like this buffet of ways of making an impact, of celebrating the impact the sun has had on us. And there's really very little jealousy around the solstice historically about how it's done, because people weren't in communication with one another. They were generally more isolated, so they everybody sort of did their own thing. Evidence of solstice ceremonies go back roughly 30,000 years. Think about that. Charting the sun's path among the oldest religious experiences of all time. 30,000 years is 20,000 years before we ever domesticated an animal or planted a row of crops, or lived in communities that weren't constantly on the move. Historically, that means that not too long after the time that we started ritually burying our dead in any kind of form, we were following the zenith and the ebb and the flow of how the sun moved. It's as if in this particular time of year in the northern hemisphere, where most of the culture of the world comes from, interestingly enough, or the culture we absorb, I should say, something deep inside us calls us to the light. If anyone's traveled down PCH, you see the amount of time and length of cars to go in that neighborhood where all the lights are. Just prior to solstice fall, the time where there was a lot of cattle and community didn't think that they'd be able to get through the winter and feed. So interestingly enough, as much as it's cold and the sun goes down early and it's dark, these sort of dark days in December were really kind of a party time in many places. December was also the time of the year when a lot of the wine and beer made from harvesting the plants were finally ready to drink. So although the celebrations of solstice in the northern hemisphere, which were often fairly raucous, there was this fear of hungry and cold being around the corner, but it was really kind of a time of plenty in an odd sort of way, right? The harvest had just happened. I'm going to show you a few examples, some that persist today. I'm not really sure how many of they persist and how strongly they persist, but I want to sort of walk us around the little buffet of images here of the darkest days of the night and the stories of hope that are filled with it. In Japan, there's a sun goddess, Amaterasu, who emerges from a cave at this time, and she is sort of thought to be the bearer of the sun. And there's also in the Japanese tradition, I'm sort of going to walk us across the globe a little bit. People historically took hot citrus baths in Japan. I don't know how strong that tradition is. And they eat a fruit called yuzu, which tastes like grapefruit. And it's said that it's the solstice is the day that is reminiscent closest to death. So people warm up their bodies and they're sort of like ushering in the spring with this ceremony. In China, there's the Dongzhi festival. It's around the winter solstice, and people eat these sticky rice flour balls, and they're easy to make. It's a big it sort of celebrates, the very word has connections to reunion, and it has, the holiday has connections to sort of the yin and yang of the dark and light, but these dumplings are kind of made with different colors. That's part of the solstice thing. In Iran, if we're sort of moving a little bit, what we would call west, winter solstice of Yalda. Yalda means new birth, and the Iranians think of this as the longest night, and it's sort of fruit is eaten as part of this festival. It's a big kind of family time as well. And north of that, of Iran and Poland, there's kohl-YAH-da, which is a Slavic Polish tradition around the winter solstice. It was, Penny might know that it was called Olvson before that. And people in this part of the world historically dressed up like, someone would dress up like a horse. Two people would get under things or a cloak that made them look like a horse, and they would carry around a goat's head, and they would carry around kind of a candle lit in something that looked like a star celebrating the sun. And when Christianity came, that sort of star became the sun, right? The sun became the sun. S-U-N to S-O-N. In the Germanic and Slavic traditions, we're all familiar with the idea of there being a Yule log being burned. This was sort of like a little bit north of there, but still part of that traditional Western sort of, or Eastern European culture. And there was a Yule pig that was eaten, and it's from these people that we get the Christmas tree. There's an image of Father Christmas riding a Yule goat. If you go north into Scandinavia, there's this day called St. Lucia's Day. It's the beginning of the Christmas celebration, and the eldest daughter would walk around with a white robe and sort of have this kind of like green crown with candles lit on it. It was St. Lucia was a martyr in the 4th century, and she comes from Italy, but somehow this became a Scandinavian tradition. Earlier celebrations in the Norse people, people would scare off evil spirits, and they incorporated solstice there. Modern Festival of Light combines elements of pagan and Christian traditions in all these sort of ceremonies. In Scotland, there's Hogmanay, which is a New Year's festival, but it's really kind of celebrated around the solstice because they come so close together, and it's sort of torchlight ceremonies inherited from the Vikings and their wild parties in late December. Stonehenge has its own solstice ceremony. The sun comes up between this trillion. So they're at it too there. If you go south into Spain, there's this thing called Las Hogueras, which is translatable to Night of the Bonfires, and candles in many other parts of the world are sort of translated for these bigger blazes. It's sort of a coastal tradition in Spain, inland as well to some degree, and couples and people would jump over the fire as an act of good luck. They do it also at the summer solstice as well. You know, again, just it's always relating to light, of course. In St. Thomas in Guatemala, people climb up these 50-foot sort of like, I don't know, poles, pillars, and they do these courageous jumps off, tied with sort of what you might call primitive bungee jumping. It's called Palo Valdor. It's also done in the Mayan Mexican, but it's the biggest places in Guatemala. And then in Peru, there's Inti Raymi, which is a solstice ceremony. These are just a few of the ceremonies. I thought it'd be kind of fun to see them. Solstice has its word in the meaning sun, sol, of course, and it also stands technically for, it's not really named for the angle, which we would think of it as, where like the sun hits the earth and sort of where it comes in. That's how we see it, but it really, the word means like when the sun stands still, sol, sun still. And it was named because, you know, when you see like there is sort of a point at the top of an arc where things kind of, when it's going up, there's like a moment of stillness there. So the sun at that time seems to be less in motion. So that's really kind of where the name comes from. We, of course, know that those that invented solstice didn't, you know, they had the experience, understandably, of it sort of rising in the east, right? We know that we actually spin into the sun, don't we? It's not the same thing as it really rising in the east. That, of course, changes the perspective of things. We, of course, also know that seasons simply exist because the earth is tilted a little bit. If it wasn't tilted, we wouldn't have the dramatic change in seasons as you move further north, right, where the sun has gone away. That dip, if we were sort of, right, perpendicular around the sun, we wouldn't have seasons. So that little alteration in the Earth's angle makes all the difference. These truths would have probably made a big difference to the pagans, probably would have saved them from moving a lot of stones around. But solstice is not, in its essence, a cosmic event like a supernova is. Solstice is the human experience of being on a planet that spins. Think about that. Had our ancestors known that, they would have saved themselves a lot of trouble, maybe. Today, we know that, flat earthers aside, of course, that light will return and we have confidence in how and exactly why that happens. So as curious as I am about religious practices built off the solstice, and I kind of am, I believe that the vast diversity of sun-worshipping efforts that have ritualistically begged the sun back, which is really essentially what they're asking to do, can be categorized with a whole ton of other outdated religious ideas that we've moved on from. Documenting the path of the sun is for me more an act now of science that we have mastered than a theology we need to re-explore or hold on to. So with apologies to all the Druids in the past and those who are just back from their annual trip to Stonehenge, and Penny Trinnell, who is our representative pagan, I really don't care about celebrating the solstice, no offense to Penny, who I adore, and I bet you don't either. I, like you, am not a religious person inclined to look backwards to fix the challenges of today. In fact, I think that we look backwards way too often to fix the religious and spiritual problems of the day. We no longer worry whether the sun will creep in between carefully placed rocks to light up a carefully constructed tomb. People of conscience today are much more called to worry about those swirling lights of hurricanes that exist in the Caribbean so often on our flat screen TVs. So ironically, and it is ironic, although we no longer wonder about how the sun might behave, we do worry a lot about whether the warmth will come back to our globe, not at all, but in too strong a way. We wonder much more about our collective impact on the earth and the power of the sun to warm us than we do about whether the sun's coming back. That's an important switch. We're worried now much more about our impact on the ecology than the sun's impact on us. When I think about how we as a species might incorporate a more earthly spirituality, and I think about that quite a bit, it's clear that we need a new planet-focused religion that sort of updates solstice. A new modern religion and accompanying traditions that chart the journey of the sun, but also chart our journey on the planet. It's clear from history, from all these rituals we see, that like the religious ideas ebb and flow. We have to create new religions, and that's okay. I love that stopping to religiously look and spiritually concern ourselves with the sun links us to our ancestors. I wouldn't have delivered that prayer had I not. And in fact, it's kind of a bold thing to say, but thinking about the earth, really thinking about anything but our relationship with the earth, could arguably be considered a religious fad. It's worth saying that the spiritual trend we are in, we might be moving away from it, but the religious trend of all the world religions we would identify with, from Hinduism to Buddhism to Christianity to Judaism and all of them, Islam, all the present world religions are fundamentally related to the way that we morally relate to one another. Why wouldn't they? They're invented at a time in which we started to live together in large groups of people. So here's the take-home New Year's Eve party shocking thing to say, just to get the conversation started. You could say that my minister said that any religion not primarily related to the sun, the weather, and its impact on us is just a fad. Now, that nutty minister of yours wouldn't go so far as to saying that love thy neighbor or Buddhism's eightfold path is a fad. But if you dared, it's a line worth talking about to stir up conversation at dinner or over a cocktail. If not, wake us up and pull us forward a little bit. Now that we know how things work, and better why things happen, we have again to religiously concern ourselves with controlling the environment. And we are not, at least not enough yet. That will change in our lifetimes, and certainly in the lifetimes of our kids. Solstice is important because it obviously reminds us how interconnected we are to the environment. And in doing so, how dangerously interconnected to nature the wave of religious traditions that most of us participate in are. We know now the buffet of solstice rituals and traditions might strike us as a little archaic. They can also provide for us the perspective and the reminder that we live on a spinning planet dependent on a mother star. Solstice remind us that biology rules and how easily it is to religiously overlook that. Solstice also can be a reminder that we're, as a species, in a different place than we've ever been before. Solstice may not be important anymore to fill up carefully constructed stone caves, but it should refocus our attention on very important matters. If we're going to save the planet to be a useful place for billions of us to live in the future, we're going to need religious holidays to draw our attention back to earthly natural phenomena. I believe that if we fail to know our full religious history, which we are only beginning to pull into our frame of consciousness, we're going to likely miss that we are a species on a journey. And we need to hold on to ideas that pull us forward, transform us, or we will get stuck on that journey. So although I have no interest in reclaiming the traditions of the ancient solstice rituals, it does make me wonder what rituals and temples and our ancestors might help to pay our attention to what we need to pay attention to moving forward, and we could use some help with that. Amen. Oh, thanks. We now for a little humor from our resident radical.
It's a good day to have a laugh at a teacher, no less. A girl, a teacher, and a whale. A little girl was talking to her teacher about whales. The teacher said it was physically impossible for a whale to swallow a human because even though it was a very large mammal, its throat was very small. The little girl stated that couldn't be true, for Jonah was swallowed by a whale. Irritated, the teacher reiterated that a whale could not swallow a human. It was physically impossible. Well, the little girl said, when I get to heaven, I will ask Jonah what happened. And the teacher asked, what if Jonah went to hell? And the little girl replied, then you can ask him. Beware the children. They'll get you.
Give generously for the life and work of this church. Thank you, Rach. I was sitting there imagining Michael being very tiny and playing a violin. Please join me in the affirmation of gratitude up on here and in the bulletin. Let us be grateful when we are able to give, for many do not have that privilege. Let us be grateful for all those who share their gifts, for we are enriched by their giving. And let us also be grateful for our needs, so that we may experience the generosity of others. And now for our closing hymn. More performance than anything else.
You don't know this one. I'm going to let Michael get his music. Lady of the season's laughter, in the summer's warmth be near. When the winter follows after, teach our spirits not to fear. Hold us in your steady mercy, Lady of the turning year. Sister of the evening starlight, in the falling shadows stay here among us till the far light of tomorrow's dawning ray. Hold us in your steady mercy, Lady of the turning day. Hold us in your steady mercy, Lady of the turning day.
In closing, let us remember that this church is dedicated to the proposition that behind all of our differences and beneath all of our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together. In spite of time and death and the space between the stars, we pause in silent witness to that unity.
May the blessing of love be upon you. May love's peace abide with you. May love's presence illuminate your hearts now and forevermore. So be it. Amen. Shalom. Salam. Namaste. And blessed be. Glad we got you back to work. Thanks for being here. Please remain seated for our postlude.